Hi, I'm Simon Bailey and welcome to the Business of Indie Games 2018. I'm here with Ella Romanos, the games finance expert. In her final year of university, Ella founded and ran work-for-hire dev studio Remode, where she built a 20-strong team. Since 2014, Ella has founded Strike Game Labs and Rocket Lolly Games. She's highly respected and sought after for her work with investors and studios, advising in investment structures for games, as well as focusing on finances and business models for games as a service or live ops. Ella was voted as one of the 100 most influential people in games just 4 years after leaving university. During the last 5 years, she was a finalist in the Innovator of the Year category for the Women in Technology Awards, named in Develop's Top 30 Under 30, been a finalist in the TIGA Awards Leadership category, and twice listed in MCV's UK Top 100 Women in Games, including as a finalist in the Business Woman of the Year category. That's an amazing resume. What's also cool is that she's achieved all of this while being based in Devon in South Wales, southwest of England. She now lives between Devon and France. Ella is incredibly influential in the games business and is an extraordinary human being. Hi, Ella. Welcome and thank you for taking the time to be here today.
No worries. Thank you for having me.
So how come Remote happened when you're in your final year of university?
So the two people that I founded the studio with were in the year above me. So they graduated. So they wanted to start up and I joined them whilst I was still in my final year. Obviously they were working full time and I was helping out. But then as soon as I graduated, I joined full time.
What did you learn from building like a team of 20 people doing work for hire?
Things are a bit different now, but kind of 10 years ago, we didn't really have any. Our course was really good and it taught us a lot about making games, but it didn't really teach us anything about the industry, about how it worked, about how to, frankly, do business. And I think it's really good now to see a lot of courses do kind of focus more on that. They get students to go to events, they really encourage them to build their network. But we didn't have that. So to be honest, I think a lot of it was naivety and just pure determination. We didn't really have anything to lose. We kind of thought, well, if it fails, we'll just go and get the jobs we would have got anyway, and it will probably count in our favour that we tried. We didn't have mortgages, nobody had kids. It's actually in some ways easier to do it at that point.
You have to deal with quality issues, scheduling issues, feature creep. So you must have learned completely the inside of development, customer relations, all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, and there was initially for the first kind of 3 years we were tiny. There was the 3 founders plus kind of 1 or 2 others, and at that point it was fairly straightforward. The projects we were working on were very small. There was obviously not very many of us to manage, but then we kind of reached a point after about 3, 4, 5 years old where we really grew quite quickly. And that was a huge learning curve because up to that point, we didn't have anybody in the company who'd ever worked for anyone else, in games. So everybody had kind of learned as they were going. And, there were limitations to those, just trying to manage a team, trying to manage large projects and more projects. We learned so many things. For example, we by making mistakes, we realized that it wasn't a case of, if you have more people, you can take on more projects. It just doesn't work like that. Actually, what you need is bigger projects because, I don't know if this is the same for everyone, but we found that if there was more than 3 projects running in the studio, no matter their size, no matter their budget, no matter their complexity, it just broke because as soon as you have one issue, the snowball effect was huge. So there were so many things like that we literally learned by getting things wrong. Putting proper HR processes in place, putting proper, frankly, actual project management processes in place when you couldn't just all be sat around one desk. We did really go out and try to learn from other people. So we spent a lot of time trying to kind of build a network, not just for business, but for mentors and for, getting information off them. We did quite a lot of training where we could. Often it wasn't game specific, but things like leadership and management. We did training on those sort of things. So we always tried to learn from other people.
I've heard you speak a lot about, on YouTube actually, about being honest about where you're at and asking for help, because we don't know everything. And there are good people out there. I've certainly had a game designer or a producer save my bacon, just by asking for help and getting when something's got into a muddle.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to admit that you don't know. And I think particularly when you don't know at all, it's very tempting as a startup to feel like you have to pretend you know so that people will respect you and people will take you seriously. And there is an element of that. I mean, obviously you need to look professional, but at the same time, I think it takes a lot of courage to say, I don't know, I need some help. And in my experience, the games industry is incredibly supportive. The people in it are very, very supportive. And, we found some people who, I could be quite honest with and say, I don't know, can you help me with this? And people would always help. I think it helps you hopefully to avoid too many big pitfalls. You do have to be careful because obviously everybody's experience is different. The industry changes quickly. So I think the word of caution on that is you don't just ask for advice and then do it. You ask for advice, then you consider it, and then you decide on your course of action. But I think, being able to ask for advice, be able to be honest, and, being able to recognize your own personal strengths and weaknesses as well as your professional ones is really important.
What are you doing right now across your studios and also in your consultancy?
I spend a lot of my time on my consultancies. With Strike Game Labs, I essentially work on the commercial side. So the team that are developing the game are working on that. They're a really good, experienced team. In fact, they're all team members from Remode originally. So, I just support them on kind of commercial aspects. For Rocket Lolly Games, we're making a mobile game for the Rocky Horror Show. And that's kind of just about to go. We're sort of in kind of soft launch period, making some adjustments and so on. So hopefully that will launch towards later this year. And then on the consultancy side, which takes up a lot of my time, we're working a lot with developers, investors and IP owners. So with investors, we tend to help them with, either finding developers, doing due diligence, even setting up how they could run their funds, as it were, particularly if they come from outside of games. With brand owners, it's often they either, they have an IP that is either existing or new that they want to turn into a game, but they're not necessarily from games. So we kind of work with them to turn an idea or a concept into reality, whether that's game design, monetization design, putting a team together, overseeing production. And then with developers, again, it can be, we do a lot of kind of market readiness reports, investor readiness reports, so helping them to assess the commercial potential and then, explain that to potential investors.
Wow, thank you. That's a really broad remit you have there. Really.
Well, it's not just me, my business partner, Oscar Clark, and a couple of others that I work with. So my kind of area of expertise is the finance and production. So I tend to get involved when it's related to raising finance or obviously from the investor side, investing in, and particularly related to production, business strategy, things like that. My business partner covers kind of marketing, design, monetization. You've
built an amazing reputation for yourself in the games industry as an investment expert, supporting studios in getting investment ready, as well as working with investors to understand the different structures by which they can invest in games. What hurdles do you find that indies and studios come up against most when they're looking for funding?
There's a lot of typical ones that people talk about a lot. Obviously making sure that, frankly, you pitch it in the right way. I think one of the biggest problems that I see is that, there's multiple forms of investment, but broadly, if you're talking to private individuals or organizations, you can split it into project financing or company financing. And very often I see that developers don't understand this or don't understand which of the two the organization they're pitching to falls into. And it's fundamentally different. If you're pitching a project, you focus on the project. If you're pitching the company, you can't just pitch a project. So I think that's kind of the immediate thing that you see from a lot of companies. And I'm looking back at stuff that we did at Remode and beyond, you know, we got that wrong as well. So I think it's really a lack of understanding of the people they're pitching to and what they need to get out of it. You know, and frankly, the way to know that is just to ask. You know, usually people are quite happy to share that information. It's not private. They might not have it on their website, but if you say to them, you know, what are you looking for? They'll usually share that with you. I think the other thing is it needs to be a partnership. If you're going into investment into business with people, then they have to respect you and you have to respect them. And you've got to go into business with people who you feel you can work with. And often I think, and understandably so, developers, you know, feel like, you know, they are lucky to get the investment, obviously, but it's not always, they don't always feel like they have the right to sort of go, actually, no, this isn't right for me. And that's really important because, you know, whilst it's very easy to say this, it's often worse to take money that's wrong than to not have money at all. And I think, again, that's another thing you see quite a lot. And then there's all the kind of standard things, actually, like, you know, how to pitch, how to build a relationship. You know, it is important, you know, if the people you're pitching to know you and respect you, then you're already starting off in a place, you know, in a stronger place than somebody you're pitching to cold. So kind of building those relationships and understanding the value of networking.
I've certainly had those experiences myself as well. You know, in the beginning, we would just pitch, you know, whatever we sort of thought was a good idea, and we'd be told that was wrong, and we kind of learn by just keep going back, you know, because we found publishers will always listen to you because they know that at some point you could come up with something really special. So we've also found them to be very sort of helpful in terms of like providing information, letting you know what they want. As long as you're kind of just not too egotistical, the door's always open as well, right?
Absolutely. You know, I think a lot of the time the first thing you pitch to anyone is probably not going to get through, but that, you know, if the respect and the relationship you build through pitching things could then, like you said, you know, come around later for something you try and pitch in the future, and you'll learn from that experience. You know, we did so many terrible pitches, you know, that now I'm just kind of think, oh my God. But you know, you learn from those, and you know, looking back now, I can kind of see why those didn't work.
And it's great to sort of hone your skills and become more professional, and then you can not only make a great game, but you can also tell the story of that great game, which helps, of course, with the marketing too. Yeah,
exactly. And I think, you know, not understanding the commercial side of marketing, live operations, whatever it is a real challenge for developers. You know, and obviously if you're going to a publisher in a certain way, they will handle a lot of that for you. But equally, I think you still need to understand it even and have a plan for it, even if you're not the one that's going to execute it, because it's your vision, it's your project. You know, you should know why you're making it, who you're making it for. You know, every possible idea you ever have, surely that's the basis for making it. So if you don't know that, then how are they going to know that?
What can individual developers or small studios do to make themselves investment ready? How do they sort of make themselves attractive?
God, that's a big question. So you've got two kind of studios, right? Startups without any experience and startups with an experienced team. You know, they may have 20 years experience in making games, but they may not know about the business side. And I think, you know, the reality is that the more experienced your team is, and the more track record you have, the less you have to prove with the game. So, you know, if you are a graduate startup, it's really frustrating because no one will give you a chance until you've made a lot of the game. But, you know, frankly, it's not actually unreasonable because, you know, from a publisher or investor's point of view, that's a huge risk if you've never done it before. Whereas if you're, you know, an experienced team coming out, you know, you've worked at a big studio for 20 years, you know, you've all made a lot of games, then, you know, the ability to actually deliver that is probably not in question so much. So I think understanding kind of where your risk points are is really important, and then addressing those. And it might not be an easy answer. It might be you've got to find a way to make a quarter of your game before they'll even talk to you. But I think recognizing what those points are and not getting frustrated when you see a game that got funded off a concept but that won't happen to you, because it is frustrating. I remember we used to find that when we started up, we said, it's not fair. You know, they got funded off of concepts. It's like, yeah, but they probably worked at Rare for 15 years, you know, and it's kind of obvious why. So I think, you know, identifying where your weaknesses are and addressing them, and being realistic and trying to look at it from the other person's point of view. You know, why would they invest in you? How can you address those risks? It's probably the kind of key starting point.
Actually, that's my next question. You know, the video games industry at its heart is a hit-driven business. So how do you tackle the investment risks? Because there are no guarantees, are there, when it's a hit-driven business?
Assessing the market, so that, you know, if, you know, the genre and the other games that are out there already, to look at the potential upside. So I think financial planning is one of these things that is very difficult, because, you know, a lot of developers that say to me, oh, you know, how can I possibly know what it's going to make? And I think the way we've started to explain it to people is, it's not what you think you're going to make, it's what in theory you could make. So it's important to look at kind of, you know, the highest case and a medium case based on other games of similar ilk in the last few years. Yes. And that, you know, so that the investor can understand, well, this is the potential market that they're working within, and therefore this is the maximum we can expect. This is, you know, a reasonable kind of middle ground. And obviously that's all assuming that it is a hit in the first place. But I think the other thing is that, particularly now with games as a service, it's much easier to test and fail early. And I think, you know, it's really, really important. And even actually with products now, the way that, you know, more sort of premium games are going, it's still, you're still able to do that. And I think that, you know, being able to say to an investor, look, you know, okay, we need, you know, X amount of money to make the game over 2 years. But after 6 months, we have some KPIs here that say, we will test this with users. If we don't hit these KPIs, then we will review it, and it will be subject to cancelling the entire project. Or we can all agree to move forward and make some changes or whatever. But having kind of those points where you don't have to actually get to release to know if it's going to succeed or not, I think is a real way to mitigate risk. I think investors are still struggling with that. It's something we've been talking a lot to investors about. I think, you know, investors who are experienced in games have been doing this a long time, but it's still not absolutely the norm. But I think it's a really important thing to consider. These days, I'm not sure, it's a bit more difficult with console, but certainly on Steam, there are figures that show, you know, what your game can sell in that genre. Yeah. How many downloads there are. That, for the first time, really, that information's been so readily available. Yeah, I mean, it can be really hard to get data, and it is a massive problem. You know, obviously, like I said, Steam Spy, you know, is, you know, people, I think it's supposed to be sort of up to 10 to 20% inaccurate. But if you're taking enough games, that 10 to 20% inaccuracy doesn't really matter. And as long as that's noted, then, you know, it's fine. I think, like you said, for console, it can be really difficult. For mobile as well, obviously, some of that information is behind paywalls. But, you know, there are ways to access certain data. There's App Annie as well, isn't there, on mobile? Yeah, exactly. So, you know, you can, you know, we use publicly available sources of data to put together this stuff for investors, for investment firms. So it is out there. It's just sometimes more difficult to reach. And frankly, with console, you know, I've, you know, even gone and spoken to friends who've released games and asked them to give me their data on a private basis. And, you know, if you've got relationships and networks and so on, that's possible. So I think, you know, it's not always easy, but it's definitely doable. Do you know of any other places where developers could look, our listeners? I mean, like I said, I mean, App Annie, and there's a couple others similar, is mobile. Steam Spy is for Steam. Console, I don't do a huge amount of work on console. So I said, you know, the way we've often worked is that often the games are on PC as well. And so, you know, you can take that, and then maybe you can get some publicly available figures about overall sale numbers and extrapolate from that. Basically, you'd get your ROI based on your return on investment from the PC version, and then calculate, you know, a similar percentage or a smaller percentage for the console from there? Well, it's one way to do it. I mean, for example, if you can find somewhere where they've announced, you know, any kind of sales across all the different platforms, and you can try and use that to then extrapolate out. I mean, it's a huge amount of assumptions, and the more, obviously, those you make, the worse it gets. And if you can get actual data, that's better. You know, some developers do release actual data, you know, in blog posts or whatever else. But it is notoriously difficult. It's a problem for the industry, definitely.
I was very excited every time you say, games as a service. I get excited, the potential. We'll cover that in a bit. Just further on the investment side, I've heard you speak on YouTube, about putting different pieces of funding together to make up your game budget. What pieces of finance are best? I know there are like 7 sources, including VC and crowdfunding, project funding, etc. But what pieces are the best? It can be quite a juggle sometimes to manage the multiple stakeholder needs, when you get pulling in the finance from various parties.
It is really hard. I think a lot of particularly sort of startups, and again, I would put myself in this years ago, you kind of think, I'm going to make this game, or I'm going to raise the money for it, and then I'm going to make the game. It doesn't usually work like that. It's usually I'll get a bit of money, do a prototype, get a bit more money, do a bit more, and it's an ongoing thing. And therefore, you've always got to basically be looking at the next piece of funding, which is why it's such a time-consuming thing. I think there's no kind of one size fits all. The biggest challenge is that some types of funding conflict. So, if you take a certain type of funding at the beginning, it might exclude you from something else in the future. So I think it's really important to have a roadmap. And I remember actually when we started Strike, we actually had a big sort of tree diagram of like the different routes of funding. And then from that, all the different other routes that we could go to through the different phases. And the problem is that to be able to put that together, you've really got to understand the sort of what's out there and what all the requirements are, which is really, it takes a lot of time to get to understand that. But I think all you can do is consider where you are. Consider what type of funding is suitable. If you want funding for a prototype, that's very limited. You've got the UK Games Fund. You've got basically getting the money yourself through work for hire, through friends and family, whatever else. You may be able to get an angel investor who's really behind it, who will invest, but you're very limited. However, once you get to having a prototype, then you've got more options. And I think as you go through, more and more options open up, basically. But I do think, particularly with publishers, there's a trend more and more that they are funding later and later. And in fact, a lot of publishers now, I was having a discussion the other day about whether some of them could still be called publishers, even though we do call them that, because they're only funding, for example, user acquisition. And I still call them publishers in all my talks but actually, is that what they are anymore? And who knows? So I think you've got to look at kind of,
they're like a marketing function in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And that is part of what a publisher does. So that's why I still call them a publisher. But somebody asked me, well, should they be called publishers? And it made me think. So, everything's always changing and evolving.
Do you do much outside of the UK? Are there prototype funds in other territory? Finland has been successful, is that right?
Yeah, so Finland has TBoIG, which is like a government scheme which has funded quite a few companies. And I think they originally funded Supercell, which is kind of why a lot of people talk about it. And obviously I don't know it directly, but from my understanding, it's been very effective. But obviously that's not really available, unless you're Finnish. So I think, different countries have different things. I think some countries are better than others. I think the UK is actually fairly lucky. It could be a huge amount better. And there needs to be a lot more, but in comparison to some countries, it's actually not that bad.
Tiger's done some really great work as well, lobbying the government.
Yeah, Tiger and Ukie, and obviously, the government latest budget gave a bit more money to the UK Games Fund, nowhere near what they wanted or needed, but at least it was something. We do have the tax relief, which helps. And there are government incentives like SEIS and EIS, which encourage investors to invest. But it's hard, and I think particularly that. What we don't have isn't a lot of things we don't have, but particularly what we don't have is enough prototype funding. Having more, the UK Games Fund having more funding, for example, I think would have made a huge difference, because they're very limited on the amount they can give and the number of projects they can fund. But obviously at that stage, it's very, very risky for private investors.
Yes, I agree, but also it's never been as easy to measure whether your prototype is going to be successful or not, because you could get the prototype funding, and then, as you said, with the KPIs that you get back, if you have enough users, then it's worth further funding, you know?
Yeah.
So you kind of get instant results in whether your project is worth funding or not, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, pretty much a lot of the publishers I talk to now, particularly on sort of games as a service side, I would say almost exclusively, they will only fund once you have data. And, you know, what that data is a bit variable, but from my experience, it generally means you have to be at soft launch or close to even get publisher funding for free-to-play games. And that's a real challenge. I think in some ways, you know, if you're making a premium game, publishers like who fund premium games will actually get involved earlier. I think we're starting to really come across an issue where free-to-play games can't get funded before they've got data. And the budgets for free-to-play games are going up and up. Yeah, and I think that's a real challenge.
Once you've secured funding for the studio, what about managing the relationships with investors and funders? What do developers need to know there?
The thing with those relationships is often investors are fine at the beginning, and they're fine until something goes wrong. And I've never known a project that doesn't go wrong in some way at some point. Like, that is how projects work, right? They just, something goes wrong. And, you know, most of the time it's fixable. But the problem is that if you've got investors who feel uninformed, who feel it hasn't been transparent, who haven't kind of feel like they haven't been warned or understood it, then they can actually make the situation a lot worse. And it's not unreasonable for them to be annoyed at that point or unsupportive or hold things up demanding, you know, for different justifications, because actually they don't understand how they got to this point, because they thought everything was sunny and lovely, and suddenly wham, something goes wrong. So I think even if investors feel, you know, happy and relaxed and, you know, they're fairly hands off, I think it's really important to still communicate and to make sure that you're transparent, that they know exactly what's going on, that, you know, they understand how things work, and that all stakeholders are involved. So, you know, one of the problems can be that, you know, if particularly if you've got an approvals process, so if you're working with a financer who requires or wants some kind of approval on things, you know, making sure that that process is transparent and recorded is really, really important. Because, you know, for example, if you need approval on something and an investor funder gives it, and then that thing goes wrong in the future, you know, you need to be able to protect everybody and have a sort of history of what happened to make sure that, you know, frankly, that people are held accountable in the right ways. So having that process and having a way to track accountability, you know, responsibility, who said what, you know, what was approved when, is really important. And it's something that I think is not that, well, it is common in bigger companies, particularly for smaller developers. It's quite difficult.
I've always found like the approach of being very cautious, you know, not too over optimistic, and under promising and then over delivering, you know, it's a way to play it.
Yeah, I mean, what some things I've seen with, you know, where I've been kind of the middle person, as it were, between investors and developers, is that, you know, there's always little delays here and there in development. Like, you know, you set out, you know, in your first milestone, you say you're going to do all this stuff, you do a sprint and you realize something isn't quite right, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't mean that the game's not going to come out on time or on budget, but, you know, often you have those, like every sprint, just little things, right? Now, particularly if you're working with investors who aren't from development, that can look like a really big problem to them, because they, you know, it just does. It looks like you're always delayed and always getting things wrong. Whereas in reality, I think, you know, anyone who's worked in games, made a game, knows that that's just the way it goes. And so, you know, making sure that the language you use and how you communicate what you're going to deliver, and like you said, don't overpromise, but equally be clear, is really important.
Besides crowdfunding and publisher investment, how have you supported the non-sophisticated or accredited investors to put their cash into games, you know, particularly indies?
obviously there's quite a few investment funds that invest in small companies, and there are kind of individuals who do it as well. I mean, from a personal point of view, I've worked with an investor to fund loans against tax relief, which is quite a good thing because obviously it's fairly low risk from the investor's point of view, but it can give the developer quite a lot of cash up front. And I've also worked with different investment funds. A lot of investment funds now obviously use SCIS and EIS to reduce, to encourage investors to get involved, which has worked really well. And I think, a lot of the investments come into indie projects in the last 5 years has been pretty much all of it, particularly project financing, has been focused on SCIS, EIS investments.
Do you have any case studies or stories that you could share with us where that's been successful?
In Strike, we had one of the SCIS funds invest in our project. They've been incredibly supportive. I know that they invested in probably 60 or 70 or more games, over a few year period. Small amounts of money, kind of up to the 150k SCIS limit. But they funded a huge number of small developers who could make games for that kind of budget. And that made, a lot of the kind of indie titles that have come out of the UK were funded by that organisation and a couple of others. And I think, the number of small projects that were able to get funded, which were obviously very creative and, quite a few commercially successful as well. But those projects often helped to start a lot of studios, particularly at a time when people were leaving bigger studios or bigger studios getting shut down. They really were able to support the industry. And I think that there's probably, the number of small studios we have nowadays is probably a lot influenced by those funds. And then, for Rocket Lolly, we've had private investments. There's some angels who are from the industry, and they invested in our project. They invested in a few other projects as well. They don't advertise themselves because they're angels, but that's been a really good process because they've been a lot more involved because they're individuals and they invested in a project that they were personally interested in. So that's been a really different but really interesting process.
Where do you think the quickest wins are at the moment with the least strings, for independent studios?
I think the problem is there is a lot of different investment out there available, like funding of different types, and it's actually finding the one that is suitable for you that is the problem. So we have a directory of finances on our website, which I don't know how many's on there, but there's a lot on there, and we vet that for relevance. So we don't just put anyone up there. It's generally people who are investing in UK or EU games companies at the moment, and they have to show that they've actually done that sort of investment. So it's not like we just if we just did everyone who said they did it, and then the list would be even bigger.
What's your web address there, please?
It's finances.fundamentallygames.com.
Thank you. So I suppose like each different type of funder needs a different approach.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms, I don't think there's any particular easy win, but at different stages there'll be things that are more suitable. So I think the easiest place at the moment to be is in soft launch with a game, with a free-to-play game with good data. I think if you've got that, then you can get money, because and you can get, depending on the data and the potential of the game, you can get, big sums of money to support the scale of that. Because if you can show that it's good and small, and companies like Jagex are now coming in and working on, those sort of projects, there's a lot of growth in that area, but you have to get to that point first. Yes. I think the hardest place, as I said, is kind of prototype funding, and particularly for any sort of games as a service, that's really difficult. And I think with premium, there's actually, quite a few publishers in particular that will fund sort of PC type content. But again, they'll probably want some kind of prototype depending on the team. I
suppose, the advantage then would be to have somebody like Jagex with all their experience to help you make the most of it. Because in a way, once you've reached that position where you've got data and you've got your soft launch, then do you need further funding in a way? Because then the customers can fund it, can't they?
Usually it takes a period of time, you know, from soft launch into full launch before you actually make enough money to be able to reinvest enough to keep it going. You might be lucky, you know, if it really goes off that quickly, then you might have enough, but you know, you need to invest in marketing and you need to invest in development every month forever for the lifetime of the game until you want it to die. And, you know, having enough to do that, you know, normally we recommend that developers assume that their funding budget, so their development budget, includes at least 3 months, often 6 months beyond full launch, so that it covers that period. It may be slightly lower, but you know, normally we now recommend kind of a quarter or a third of their dev budget is kept for kind of soft launch and beyond. You know, things don't necessarily scale as quickly as you want to, and you often have to put more in than you get out until it kind of tips the balance, as it were. So, you know, there are companies like Pollen VC who will essentially advance you money from your revenue from Apple ads, and you can put that back in, so that can create a snowball effect, and that's effectively free money. Or you can go to a publisher and they can invest more. And the good thing about a publisher is that if you're a small developer and not really experienced or set up to run live ops properly, they can help you with that.
I think in the console space as well, Sony and Microsoft, if they like something, they will give you some marketing equivalent, you know, of like up to £250,000, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, you know, if you can show that the game is going to be successful, then, you know, it's fairly, well, it's not easy to get money, but it's, you know, it's definitely possible. It's just getting to that point is the challenge. You generally won't get project financing or publisher funding on a free-to-play game, well, games as a service game, until you're at soft launch. However, you might get equity investment. You know, if you're looking to build a business, then you may be able to get funding, you know, from a VC or from, you know, an angel, because they're looking at the business as a whole and not just the project. So I think that's kind of where you need to go. The only caveat to that is we are actually working with a financer who's looking to set up a fund who will be hopefully investing in free-to-play games earlier on. And that'll be project financing. So I think there are people looking at that space a lot, because there is a gap, and I think that we might find some new investment funds coming up that will actually help with that. But right now, I think you really need to be looking at equity company, you know, financing at that stage. This
new funder, will they also fund premium games as well as the free-to-play?
So we work with there's a few different funds looking to set up at the moment, and the chances are that they will cover the spectrum of games, yeah, in one way or the other.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that sounds very positive, very exciting, actually.
Yeah, I mean, there's always, you know, new funds looking to start up, so some I'm sure will happen, and, you know, others will delay, you know, just because of, you know, looking at the different, you know, opportunities out there. But I think, you know, there's definitely, at the moment, there's more finances than there used to be. And I think, you know, I don't think that's going to necessarily change, but, you know, it's just a case of where they fit within the chain.
Live ops is a business model that's evolved over the last few years. What are the current trends that you're seeing in 2018? Where is that cutting edge, please?
The projects that are doing live ops well are basically making a huge amount of money and lasting a very, very, very long time. But
developer heaven.
Yeah, but a lot of people are still not doing it. And I would say a lot of people still aren't even setting up their games to support it properly, because they don't necessarily understand what it is. And, you know, it's evolved to be a very specific set of things. So you have events, you have promotions, you have community management, you have problem management, you have new content and new features. And basically that's the 6 things that you need.
So what we're saying is, like, it's a live experience of what could be a game.
And actually, yeah, and I think, you know, you have to see it as, reading some of the articles by Phil Mansell, CEO of GaaS, I think is, if you want to kind of understand the ideal, you know, what they've been doing with RuneScape and what they're trying to do as a company. He talks about living games, which I think is a really cool phrase. And I think, you know, they are excellent at that because they just had to be because of RuneScape. I mean, that's what they've done. And, you know, so they are kind of leading in some ways in the sense they've been doing it so long. But I think, you know, seeing the game as this kind of, you know, living thing that will grow by the community and that you have to support is really important. And so, you know, being able to, you know, have events and have promotions and all these kind of things and have processes and systems set up and the game built in a way that fundamentally supports that is really important. And I think a lot of developers kind of make the game, put in some monetization, and then kind of try and work out how to do that stuff. And the problem is, if you're not ready, you don't have to necessarily build it all up front because there is a cost associated. I know this is actually a debate I've had with some people because I'm not sure everybody agrees with me, but I believe that making a free-to-play game is more expensive than making a premium game in general, because you have to put all this stuff in place. But there's more and more tools to do that, and as developers get better at it, and particularly developers who are already good at it doesn't cost them more. But if you're starting out from nothing, there is just, you know, it does take more time, so you can't necessarily build everything up front, but it is really important to know what you might need if it scales and not do anything that's going to go against that, you know. So
yeah, for me, it's like you have to have an authentic relationship with the audience, don't you? So you have to have stuff and be able to make stuff that's very flexible, responsive, and also really popular.
yeah, I mean, you know, there's so many things, and the thing is that a lot of it, if you do it up front, isn't complicated. You know, so one of the things we were talking about the other day is just, for example, like when you create your whatever interface you have to your back end systems, you know, if you're using GameSpot or Chili or whatever, you know, just one little thing we were saying the other day, we want the community managers to be able to give players free currency in the game if they want to, because if the player complains about something or, you know, does something, that's a really simple thing. If you go from the beginning, oh, okay, well, a community manager needs to be able to go in and give some free currency to anyone. That's not difficult to do. But if you don't build it in, it could be a complete nightmare later. Yeah. And there's so many little things like that that you just need to think through. What is all the different things that you want to be able to do? And then, you know, for new features, talking about, you know, having a really, really robust testing process, you know, before it goes into the game. Because if you're releasing a new feature, you know, once a month, once a week, whatever it is, you can't afford to have those breaking. And there's, you know, so many things like that. But it's just about thinking it through, really.
Have you seen any real innovations in this space while you've been working on this project?
I think it's still such an evolving space. I think people are still learning. You know, I wouldn't consider myself an expert in this area at all. My business partner is the one that kind of leads on this. And, you know, I mean, so for example, one of the things that we're looking at a lot at the moment, because one of the games we're working on runs on blockchain, you know, is how to really utilize that to create new experiences and support players beyond the game. And that's really cool. And I think a lot of people are looking at that at the moment. And, you know, there's a lot of skepticism about blockchain, and rightly so, because, you know, it's a new area. It's a minefield. You know, nobody really knows how it's going to work or what, but also there is a huge potential for really interesting innovation. And, you know, we've been looking at it a lot, and there's other people we've been talking to who are doing really, really interesting things and using it as a way to create new experiences for players, which is really cool.
That is interesting, and it's wonderful though that we're at this phase where there's another green field for us to play with creatively.
Yeah, I think it is. It's funny because I think the industry changes so quickly, but it's very easy as developers to kind of not get stuck in the mud, but kind of think that the rules that we work by are the rules. And so it's interesting. We work with a few people who are from outside of games, and one of our clients actually, he questions everything. And, you know, sometimes we go, but that's just the way it is. And he goes, but why? And, you know, it's been a really useful process actually, because it has genuinely made us question some of the things that we take for granted. And I think actually he's right, because that's only been in place for about 2 years. Before that, it didn't exist. So what's to say it can't change?
Yeah, and things do change extraordinarily. You know, at one point, I was charging people $3,500 to press a CD-ROM. And people would come into the studio and sit on a sofa with their hard disk and wait to pay their $3,500 to get a gold master.
Oh my God! Yeah.
Now everything's downloaded directly to the customer in real time.
Mm. Yeah, that's the thing. I think, you know, we're still a young industry, and whilst we have evolved a lot, there's still, you know, we've still got a huge amount of, you know, innovation that is happening. And I think, you know, you can kind of take the approach of getting, you know, abiding by the rules, or you can try and be someone who pushes them. And yeah, I think it's really exciting. I think it's an exciting time to be in games.
And this is like the fourth go for VR as well.
Yeah.
That I remember. You know.
Yeah, you know, I struggle with VR from a sort of player point of view. I love it, but from a commercial point of view, I really struggle.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas AR,
yeah.
I find more feasible.
Yeah, that's great if you want to get some excited new money, but the trouble is nobody's going to get it back at the end.
Actually, I think now it's really hard to get financing for VR. You know, most of the hardware manufacturers obviously were funding loads of stuff a year or two ago. They're not as much now. So I don't work that much in VR, but this is from talking to other people who do. You know, a lot of the VCs have effectively hedged their bets. So they've put money into companies and they're kind of waiting to see if they make money before doing much else. You know, and nobody is going to really invest in a project because it's probably not going to make much money.
Yeah.
Again, this is a generalization. There are exceptions, you know, but as a rule, I think it's quite hard. We basically now, when developers approach us for VR funding, we say we can't help them unless they were doing something incredibly new and different with the tech, and also if they're outside of entertainment.
What are you most excited by when people come to you at the moment?
One of the things that I'm really interested in generally is sort of cross-platform IP. And I know you know, it's not just me, I mean, this is a massive area for a lot of people at the moment anyway. But I find it really interesting, in particular because I think that, you know, development of technology means that there are ways that we can create cross-platform IPs in ways that we couldn't before. So, for example, I don't know if you've seen the Adam demo from Unity, where they made a incredible looking sort of film demo in real time.
Oh no, I haven't seen that.
If honestly, look at it, it is incredible. And you know, there's a couple of companies now who are making trailers for games using real time footage. You know, and I think that the sharing of assets is incredible. There's a huge amount of potential. So for me, like, you know, one thing is kind of the cross promotion and ability to, you know, tap into existing audience, but actually from my point of view, the technology side of it is really interesting. And I think that there's a huge amount of potential there. So projects that generally where they're using IP, particularly in new and interesting ways, are really, really exciting. And what else? You know, it's a really difficult space, and we haven't had, you know, we don't get many pitches in this, but, you know, kind of online MOBAs, again, online living games for, you know, and games particularly for more of a kind of mid-core or hardcore audience, whether that's mobile or online, you know, I think are really interesting. But those obviously tend to be quite big, so we haven't done that much in that space, but personally I find it fascinating.
It's going to be a whole new experience in a few years with that side of things.
And actually, in terms of what we do see a lot of, the things that excite me on a day-to-day basis are when developers pitch free-to-play games and actually know about live ops, because we get pitched a lot of free-to-play games that we get pitched come across as developers who want to make a game who feel they have to do free-to-play but don't really like it or are scared of it, but are pitching it because that's what they think they have to do. So when we get pitches that are from developers who truly appreciate and understand how to make a games as a service, it's really exciting, because unfortunately it's not as common as I'd like it to be.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, hopefully that will change actually in the next few months.
I think it's getting a lot better, definitely, and people are learning. You know, as they do, things take time. I think it's definitely evolving, but it's still at the point where if I get a project that really knows how to do that stuff, then it's very exciting.
When launching a new live ops game, how does the budget and planning differ from the more traditional milestone driven development?
So one of the things that I've started doing is stopped using terms like alpha, beta, and particularly gold. I've just removed them because it just isn't relevant anymore. The idea of the release date, the full launch date of the game being a significant milestone is kind of gone. It's a milestone, but it's not really any more important because you've already probably done a soft launch, you may have done a beta testing, and you've got loads of milestones ongoing. So kind of removing this idea of this full launch date being a focal point any more than others, I think is really important. The mindset of, we're starting the game today, we're going to soft launch in 9 months, full launch in a year. It's more about what's going to happen for the next 3 years. And, the point at which you rely on being able to fund the game from revenue is actually more of an important date, because that's kind of a trigger point for, do we close down or do we carry on? And then, that immediately impacts the budget, because your budget is not just based on getting to launch. As I said, it's based, on 3 months or 6 months or whatever you think it's going to take to get to the point of being able to self-fund from the game. I think the team has to be different. You will obviously need, an ongoing development team, but you're also going to need, people to support the live ops, community managers and so on, who will work closely with the dev team, but be, not necessarily from development. So you need the kind of live ops team, as it were. And realistically, I think those people kind of need to be with, not necessarily physically with the dev team, but they need to be part of the dev team. Like, I can't imagine it being done on a day-to-day basis, externally. Maybe it is, but from my point of view, we're working with fairly small teams, and I think that needs to be a close-knit team. And ideally, those people, or at least one or two of those people, should be involved in the game from day one. They need to be embedded as part of it. So you have the dev team, you have the live ops team, and I think one thing that I think can be quite challenging for a dev team is that they effectively have less control, because once the game goes live, a lot of it needs to be managed by the live ops teams, including releasing new content, adding events, adding promotions. Really the dev team shouldn't be involved in those apart from creating assets. Obviously they'll be making new features, that goes without saying, but actually releasing those, they probably won't be doing that. So it really takes you've got to have this group of people who are managing live ops who aren't the dev team, and that's got to be separate, because the dev team has to be able to do what the dev team should be doing, which is making new features, making new assets, bug fixing, and updating the game based on user requirements. They can't be adding events, adding promotions, adding new content, it just doesn't work like that. So it really changes, I think, the dynamic within the team.
Do you foresee a future where like a first playable will be released to see whether it funds and to see what the community makes of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been talking actually about making small prototypes and releasing them like in one country, putting a small amount of money into advertising just to see, and doing a few prototypes, seeing which ones catch.
Right.
And we're not, that's nothing new. Like, other people do that. I mean, definitely, a lot of the big studios, do a lot of prototypes. I don't know specifically how they do things, but they're definitely data driven. So they will, green light or not, things based on data. So they must be doing some kind of, user testing early on, whether that's closed testing or what. But, I think the studios that are successful and that have grown, and I would, I don't know specifically, but, the kind of supercells of this world, I believe that's, that everything they do is data driven. So I think that already happens, and it should happen.
I mean, it's very difficult to manage a studio and live that way. It kind of puts the developer back in the hand to mouth, where they're only going to get paid for their prototype to see whether it works. And then at the end of that, they could end up with nothing.
There's a lot of things like that are a challenge. I think, most companies that are, doing this seriously are always developing multiple, and, they will take forward the ones that work. So they might have, several small teams making small things, and then one or two get approved and those teams move on to those. So I think that's probably the way to do it. But personally, I really think that, and this is what we've done, is move towards more of a kind of film production model, where projects are, the people that work on a project are brought in usually on a contract basis to work on that specific project. So, we don't have any employees in Rocket Lolly. For that reason, everybody is brought in as they're needed. And, I don't know if obviously you'd reach a point where you need some employees. But again, I still think that working on a basis of kind of a small group of employees and then bringing in contractors like they do in film is is more of a suitable model for games. Not for everybody, but certainly that's the model we're working on. And I know, I think there's a lot more studios working like that.
Can I ask, what are the pitfalls to avoid? Like, for example, lots of games are being released too early, like they're being put out to basically for the community to bug fix them rather than, launch and then update with downloadable content and new features, etc. What other pitfalls are there?
Oh, God.
Sorry.
No, I mean, it's a huge question. There's definitely been a backlash from the community with, games released too early.
Well, loot boxes are also a terrible problem.
Yeah, and, being careful about that. Obviously, they're being very sensitive when it comes to any content for kids, particularly monetization stuff. With AR games, obviously, there's a lot of, being out and about in the real world. And I think particularly, you have to be aware of, the people that are going to release your game. So obviously Apple and Google have certain requirements, and, being aware of those is really important. And also, being aware of the, current climate, politically or otherwise, is important if you're doing anything that's slightly, around, focus on those. And then on production, obviously it's, going over budget, running out of money. I mean, all the typical things. But I think dealing with your community in the right way is probably, and that's everything from how you talk to people on social media to live ops to building a community to, all those kind of things. I think is the biggest thing, because it is obviously it's marketing, but it's not marketing in the traditional sense, in the sense you can kind of, in theory, hand it off to a publisher. It's something that you've got to do as a developer, I think, whether you do it all yourself or whether you do it in partnership with a publisher or someone else, but you've got to be engaging and building a community and managing that. And there's a lot of pitfalls, if you don't know how to, if you're not kind of PR trained and know how to deal with safety issues and all sorts, that can be really quite dangerous. And the other big thing at the moment is obviously the new data protection rules coming in.
Yeah, of course.
A lot of developers are going to fall foul of GDPR rules, and it's particularly for small developers, it's going to be a big deal. Is
the initial production time and cost shorter and cheaper for live op games, or is it longer and more expensive post launch kind of thing? If you
plan everything up front, then getting to the kind of point of having a playable shouldn't really be any more expensive. I think it's just a different spread of budget, what you need to do when. I think there probably is, particularly if you're starting out and you haven't got any of the systems set up for live ops or the processes, then there might be more cost up front getting the systems in place. But now, there's so many tools out there now to use to help you. I think, you can mitigate quite a lot of that by using third-party systems.
When you're working with a studio or an independent developer, do you help them with this side of things as well?
Yeah,
the right direction?
Yeah, quite a lot actually. It's become, particularly over the last 6 to 9 months, I don't know why, but it's become quite a big area of what we've been doing. It's become more and more important, and I think as it's become more recognised, people are realising they don't know it, and therefore they're then trying to find help. So it's become a really big part of pretty much every project we do at the moment, actually.
Do you have any information on your website about that, like you do with the list of investors?
We will do, actually. I've just been writing up a live ops template.
Oh, fantastic. How useful. That's amazing.
Yeah, I will share that with you. So it's almost done.
Thank you.
I'll get it finished this week. But I hope that kind of runs through those 6 areas that I talked about that I mentioned earlier, just in terms of the kind of things to think about.
Is there any particular difficulty with, is it a big risk to go for games as a service, or isn't everything going in that direction?
There's a lot of people kind of licensing existing IP, which which does have, in some cases can mitigate risk, but I think it also is not a kind of silver bullet, because actually, unless the audience for whatever media the IP was on already is relevant, is the audience that will want to play your game and has channels that you can reach them through effectively, then actually the IP probably may not actually add very much, and in some ways may hinder it. So, in some ways, using existing IP may be no less risky than doing new IP. And obviously, if you use existing IP, then you've got the license holders, probably license fees and all other sorts of things, brand guidelines, whatever else. So, in some ways, doing a new IP can be much simpler. I think it's more about community and, being able to reach your community easily, whether that's through an existing IP, whether that's through a community you've built on a previous game, whether that's through a publisher who has a community, whatever it is, that's really the key. So it's not necessarily about new IP or old existing IP. It's about how can you reach the people that want to play your game, particularly on mobile. That's really hard.
And I suppose that building the community, that's the reason why you do plenty of stuff up front. So how much content? I think you said maybe 1 to 3 months or even 6 months content in advance.
It really depends how much you're going to release it, but as a general rule, people are games generally add content either daily or weekly, and are adding features either kind of bi-weekly, monthly. So you need to have enough ahead of time because it needs to go through testing and all sorts. So generally, I would say that as a minimum, you want kind of 3 months pipeline ahead of time. But, in some cases you may want more. I think once you start to know like the scale of the game, then, you may need less. But obviously when you launch, if it takes off, you're going to need a huge amount of content. And then you could get caught, if you get caught out and don't have enough, then the game could fail. So, I would generally say that you want to launch with at least 3 months of content ready.
Yeah, that certainly make life easier for the developers. Otherwise, they'd have to be delivering builds with the user feedback from the community, within the month. Who's doing this really well?
Well, all the kind of larger developers, Supercell, Wooga, King, all those guys are obviously doing, making a huge amount of money from it. I think, other developers, that are really good at this stuff. There are some sort of smaller developers doing it. I mean, obviously, Natural Motion, we're, in terms of the UK, probably the best example.
What about distribution and marketing budgets for live ops games? Are they very different from the traditional ones? And what's the best approach on an ongoing basis?
I think the challenge with marketing for games as a service is that it's a monthly cost, not a fixed cost or not an activity cost. It's an ongoing cost forever. So, really, the only way to kind of budget for marketing is to have a kind of a budget that's going to cover the first few months, and then an assumption of the minimum percentage or minimal or maximum percentage of your income that you're going to spend on marketing. And, because obviously a lot of it's about most of it's about user acquisition on mobile, it is pretty much a case of the more money you spend, the more users you can get. So if you want to scale, you need to spend more money. Whereas a premium game, tends to have a kind of, launch marketing budget and then it tails off. That isn't the case with games as a service. So you can't, I think, we still see quite a lot of games as a service pitches where they say, oh, we're going to spend X on marketing. And you can't look at it like that. You have to look at it as a percentage of spend, a percentage of income. So it's kind of turning it on its head, really. And, you never know how much it's going to be, but it's going to, fundamentally, if the game is successful, it's going to be a huge amount more than you spent on the development of the game.
Are there any good games that you like that are like a mixture, kind of premium games that then supply a sort of live experience as well?
Yeah, I mean, most games now are really doing that, aren't they? I mean, apart from kind of, small indie, kind of 2-hour, self-contained experiences, which I love actually, because I can actually have time to play them through. But But you know, most kind of premium games that are larger, even if they're premium, are now operating on, you know, well, we were calling it DLC. Feels like it's kind of evolved beyond that now, because it's more of a kind of live, you know, living thing. But I mean, very few games now don't do that, because again, you know, they need to keep people engaged. They need to carry on, you know, making revenue, and you know, they've seen that there's a lot more potential to make more money if they do that, and to frankly to give players what they want, and to be able to evolve the game, because you know, if they release it and it's not perfect, at least they've got the opportunity to update it, and to, you know, I mean, you know, there's been some obviously examples where people haven't been that keen on a game when it launched, and then obviously they've updated it and improved it, and that's built a huge community afterwards.
What best pieces, in summary, what best pieces of advice do you have, A, for the indie developer, B, for the studio, and C, for people wanting to get into live ops?
Talking from a funding point of view, because otherwise I don't, you know, so many things I could talk about, but from a financing point of view, understand the landscape, the funding landscape, who's out there, and what the funders each are looking for, you know, and target the right people for what you're looking for. You know, spend time learning about that, you know, whether it's asking other people, you know, getting meetings with them, and, you know, with finances, just asking what they're looking for, you know, it's perfectly acceptable. You know, really understand it and see it as an ongoing journey to raise funding. It will never end. Studios, you go into business with people that you want to work with. You know, choose the right investors, because they're going to be there long term, and you need their support. And make sure that you respect them and they respect you. And, you know, you respecting them means communication, transparency. Them respecting you means trust. But equally, trust doesn't mean not holding you accountable. You know, so, and then live ops, I would say, you know, learn what it is, plan from the ground up. It affects development, it affects your team, it affects everything about the game and the company. And, you know, if you do it from the beginning, it's not going to be prohibitive. But if you don't do it from the start, then it could incur a huge amount of cost. And, you know, it could be a reason that your game fails, even if the game is good.
Oh, thank you so much. Really great, fascinating conversation for me. I'm sure our audience are going to love it. We're going to do a Q&A on Twitter. How can people reach you if they'd like to?
Probably best to message me on Twitter. It's Ella_Romanos. Yeah, if they want to actually get in touch about you know, anything more specific, then if you go to fundamentallygames.com, our contact details are on there.
Thank you so much. Thanks really for your time today. It's been absolutely fabulous.
No problem. It was fun.